to the Geneva Dialogue Talks. In this episode, we are talking about how changes in the global order are shaping cyber diplomacy and what this means for keeping cyberspace secure. This year shows cyber threats are growing, geopolitics shifting, and critical infrastructure is increasingly under pressure. To unpack this, we are joined by a government expert and industry leader to discuss how these challenges are playing out specifically in the ASEAN region, from regulation and risk to cooperation between the public and the private sectors. And I'm really happy to introduce our two brilliant experts, Sharifa Rashida Syed Ataman, Deputy Director General at the Personal Data Protection Department of the Ministry of Digital in Malaysia, and Zhan Zhenteo, Vice President, Head of Advisory at Ensign InfoSecurity, one of Asia's largest cybersecurity firms. This conversation is a part of the Geneva Dialogue on Responsible Behavior in Cyberspace, an initiative which is led by the Swiss government and DiploFoundation with the support of several actors. We look how different actors contribute to making cyberspace more stable and secure. And hopefully today we'll also discuss some really good practical reflections that might be helpful for our listeners in navigating today's cyber landscape. And my name is Anastasia Kazakova. I'm a Geneva Dialogue Project Coordinator and a Cyber Diplomacy Knowledge Fellow at DiploFoundation. So it was a really long intro, but hopefully that would help our listeners who still haven't heard about Geneva Dialogue. And as mentioned, we'd like to focus on specifically ASEAN region and how different actors navigating different both risks and opportunities in the cyber landscape. My first question would be about how threats are defined and felt, specifically in the light of the 2025, the year which is, I think, has brought a lot of new things in the way how we see and how we understand the technologies, but also in the way how the international order and the politics put in a lot of pressure on cybersecurity efforts. So the thing that I think a lot of people continuously say that cyber threat landscape is becoming more complex. A trivial thing, but this is what we say ourselves. State-linked actors, cross-border ransomware, and risks that come from emerging technologies. My question would be, looking at the 2025 and probably earlier, how different actors, both the private sector and the public sector in the region, think about protecting critical infrastructure today in the light of all of these changes. What are the key sort of the pains that come to your mind first, and which threats do they prioritize? How do these threat perceptions shape national and regional cyber strategies? That's a big question, but I'd like to start first with Rashida and then turn to Exi.
Thank you very much for the invitation for this dialogue. While I was introduced, currently I'm in the Ministry of Digital, but in my previous life, I was with National Cybersecurity Agency, where we were involved, a national agency in Malaysia, where we were involved in terms of coordinating, monitoring, and formulating national cybersecurity policy. So to answer your questions, I believe that the ASEAN member states, including Malaysia, we are prioritizing the element of systemic risk over any isolated incidences, where the focus that we look at is on the scale, on the speed, and spillover of the effect of any cybersecurity incidences, especially that is focusing on the crown jewel at national level, where the critical infrastructure. One of the things that we see is the ransomware as systemic disruption. We know the campaign that are financially motivated, but we also see how it behaves like a strategic disruption, where it hits most of the critical infrastructure coming from the hospital, the ports, utilities, and many more. And another part that we also see is regarding the supply chain and third-party risks, where it especially focus on the managed services, where the businesses today, organizational today, even the government, we use managed services, including the cloud's dependency. So most of the incidences, it does not start within the critical infrastructure itself. It comes from the one or two layer upstreams outside of the infrastructure itself. Excuse me, I'm sorry. Another part is at national level, when we do the coordinating of any potential threat and potential incidents, we also see the blur behavior of the threat actors and the blur intent. In order to do that, whether the attack that happened or incidents that happen, whether it comes from the criminal or state link, at that particular point of time when we try to manage nationally, and I believe that is similar within one ASEAN country to another, we actually focus in terms of operationality, in terms of how long the attack or incident persists and how hard it is for us to contain. Because we know that the capability asymmetry across the region, not only the region, even the sector nationally. In the sector itself, the subsector in each critical infrastructure, they have different capability. So we know that the sectors, the nation, or even within the nation, or even between nation to another, while we are talking regionally, we do not move in one speed in terms of capability. So one vulnerability that happened to one sector may spill over to another sector, and it may be cross-jurisdiction. And one particular things that I think everyone agreed is technology, acceleration, outpacing governance. We use all the AI, automation, data-driven system. We know that we need to integrate in our critical services for the performance, for the things that we need to do in order for the capacity and capability. But in order to do that, we really need to look into a different matter. These are part and parcel of the threats, the risks that we can see. But to answer your questions regarding how do these perceptions shape the national and regional strategies, and in my view, for ASEAN, it really shapes the strategy in a very grounded way. I mentioned earlier about the importance of focusing in terms of response, containment, and recovery. So the focus in one particular incident is firstly on the containment and recovery. It really depends on the capability and visibility of the threats that you know, and what are the controls that you put in to do that. Another one is reality is we really need to invest in cross-border coordination. One of the things that we have done is at national level between ASEAN member states, we have established ASEAN Regional CERT. And not only because this is important in terms of incident handling, we also recognize that there should be an information sharing platform where there is a possibility to extend with other stakeholders, because we know that one particular incident does not respect national boundaries, does not respect any sectors, so it needs to be contained together and respond together. So in a nutshell, nationally, I believe that one of the things that Malaysia has been invested a lot is prioritizing in terms of resiliency, how we can look into the continuity of the critical information infrastructure services, and most importantly, the whole of government's approach in terms of crisis coordination before, during, and after. And regionally, I think part and parcel, I've already mentioned that. To complement the element of the diplomacy that we are discussing at the regional and global level, this actually reflects on how ASEAN tackle the elements of the framework of responsible state behavior in terms of norm implementations and confidence building measure, where we see a grounded operationalization element can be materialized and can be understood by one another, And of course, it leads to the elements of information sharing mechanism to reduce misperceptions and escalation of the risks and threats that I mentioned earlier.
Thank you so much for providing such a comprehensive picture, and hopefully we will touch on separate elements of this broader efforts to ensure resilience. Ixi, I wonder if you have a similar perspective, or maybe there are something a different view coming from the private sector.
Yeah, I wouldn't say it's necessarily a different view, but maybe to ground it based on the context that we support in the region. Um, ASEAN is a region which is made up of many countries, different cultures, different languages, and Rashida already highlighted, there are different speeds, different maturity, different capabilities and capacities. That is the inherent characteristic of the region, which kind of defines how the region collaborates with one another. There will be some strengths in certain countries or certain sectors. There will also be certain weaknesses and lack of in certain spaces. Now, where I'm most useful in this particular conversation is to give greater texture in terms of the threats that we face. The threats that we face in the past year and the years earlier, which has been fairly well documented in our annual cyber threat landscape report, has been one where we see a rich level of coordination and collaboration across the adversary actors. And in our most recent report this year, we highlight that there are mastermind threat groups. Typically, these are very large-scale operators of cyber crimes or organized crime groups and or the state-sponsored actors. The smaller actors are essentially now coalescing their efforts around these mastermind threat groups to be able to then carry out their effects. And more often than not, the missions or the campaigns are then defined by the mastermind threat groups. And that attributes towards Rashida's point about the blurring of identity of when an attack comes. I always say this analogy: the last person that connects to you with the punch may not be actually the mastermind operator. That really creates a lot of complications when it comes towards attribution and trying to identify who is the actual perpetrator. But where ASEAN countries' typical focus would be is, what are we responsible for? What are we accountable for? And the key word is actually consequence management. We are all responsible for our stakeholders, for our customers, and so on. So putting that lens over there is the top priority that I've typically seen coming from ASEAN organizations. The second is when we look towards the mastermind threat groups, often you would see yourself having to fight against, as a victim, fighting against a much larger force. That larger force is not necessarily numerical in the sense of there are 10 people versus one person. But it could also be on the perspective that they are at a higher level of sophistication and capability versus you as a defender. So when that disparity comes about, what is increasingly seen is the need for community response. And that community, as Rashida highlighted, comes in many different perspectives. Whether it is from a group of companies or group of organizations, whether that is coming from a sector's response, whether that's coming from a national response or an immediate neighbor's response, or even across the region. There are building up efforts that are happening across ASEAN to be able to then lean on one another for such effects. Part of which is about the situation awareness and threat intelligence. There is broader threat intelligence sharing that is now occurring, not only within a country, within a sector, but across borders as well. Part of that facilitated by the ASEAN CERT. But of course, being in ASEAN, there are a lot more benefits coming from informal relationships that actually help everyone establish a bit more of the neighborhood watch scheme. So then that awareness drives action, right? A lot of the threats that we are seeing in this region concentrate towards what I call the soft underbelly of the cyber supply chain. And why? Many of the supply chain providers are essentially small and medium enterprises, of which their core business has got nothing to do with cybersecurity. Compromising them gives a threat actor um, significant trustworthy access into the victims, and with more often than not wide-ranging possibilities of impact. And yet, we across many different essential services sectors will have cross dependencies on one another. One can hardly think that we can operate without electricity. For us to be able to operate in ASEAN region where heat is quite high, there's a lot of us that depend on air conditioning, right? So without water to be able to support the ventilation and cooling systems would be unheard of. So you think about it coming from if majority of the essential services depend on these core utilities as an example, then the interdependencies are very far-ranging in nature and very intricately interwoven. So there is increasingly a concept or an understanding that there are critical infrastructure and then there are other critical infrastructure. So a level of prioritization has been accorded towards, as I alluded to, the utilities to pay special attention towards them. And I think there are broader regional effects, for example, the ASEAN grid that is about to come up, to be able to help create that community defense mechanism and possibilities of capacity and confidence to be able to address some of these shocks that we might face, all with that lens of consequence management at hand. So some of these gaps are also relating towards the competency of people and the capacity that exists in different countries. There are, as I'm aware, many efforts in confidence and capacity building across the ASEAN countries. There's a lot of cross-border sharing of resources, both in terms of soft, like playbooks, how do you actually address certain guidelines and practices, but also through the effects of building that community that I know you on the other side. And that is all with exercises, which help to then build an understanding of practices across borders, build up some of the protocols that can be exchanged, and also learning from one another. So I think a lot of the energies are really targeted into being more familiar, being able to build up some processes and protocols, and then really learning from each other's lessons.
Yes, indeed, and building, as you mentioned, this informal relationships as the important element in the consequences management, which I think ASEAN is really a great example of highlighting how within the region this investment in the different cross-border connections in the networks is really, really vital for dealing with the threats that really do not care much between the jurisdictional borders in the region. Drawing further from the threat perception to the policy execution, and you also mentioned some of the elements that are important in sort of the legal framework, supply chain security, for instance, and managing third-party providers and the services that provide an essential base for the critical infrastructure sectors in your countries. And we see how many ASEAN states have responded to the growing risks in this landscape by strengthening cyber laws and critical infrastructure protection frameworks. My question is, where do you see probably the biggest disconnects between regulatory ambition and what actually happens in practice? And what would help turn policy into effective operational enforcement without undermining innovation, hopefully? So Rashida, if you have also some ideas about that.
I will respond in terms of just expanding a little bit in terms of what I think, mentioned earlier with regards to the informal relationship and also understanding one another. One thing about things that I learned when I start from doing the thing at national level strategy and cooperations with regards to cyber. My stakeholder is the private sector, is the NGOs, is the universities, is other ministries. But when we start up to the regional and global level, the states and the counterpart that we actually work together does not come from just the national level entity. It comes national level, meaning here is national cybersecurity entity. It comes from different parts of groups, even at the government level, where it comes from the diplomat community, legal community, operational community, CERTs, technical community. And one thing I think that is where the ASEAN actually take the elements of cybersecurity. It started with the group that comes from the CERT community that serve under the pillars of ASEAN that speak about telecommunication those days. And it still exists until today. It does not come from the political security pillar. It comes from the telecommunication, where the position and representative during that time has started in terms of we are CERT. The CERTs are, we want to solve the problems. We want to make sure the continuity and performance of things being done. And if there are any problems, let's sit down and do that together. So this is where I think the strength comes from the ASEAN, where we want to solve the operational problem. So to answer your questions regarding the legislations, it is always something that we believe that law alone does not secure the critical infrastructure, because we know that regulation, when we introduce, we already have setups of things that needs to be comply by the critical information infrastructure, if we, in accordance to our discussions today. But we know the operational readiness, it will be levels are different. So the biggest gap here, while everyone's talking about legislations, it is not so much about the legislation itself. Legislation can be enacted, can be introduced, can be enforced, but the practicality of an operational readiness for the critical infrastructure in this regard to comply with, and even the regulator to actually talks together within the authority, the government, and the day-to-day organization. So while the organization, the critical information infrastructure, they know what they must comply with, but in the event of any cybersecurity incidences, they may comply the checklist, one thing, but what about if the incident happened? So this is where the element of joint cyber exercise, simulations, we need to have post-exercise debrief and reviews. Then only we know that yes, you have complied like the 100 requirements the regulators have been put in, but these, when the incident happened, you need to act under the pressure in terms of time, in terms of impact. How do you do that? The communication, the coordination, the clarity of the roles and responsibility is truly important. And another part that I truly believe in terms of working together, especially with the private sector, with the stakeholder, they actually needs to understand why the regulations are in place. While of course there are stick on it, but this is not about a punitive element. This is about making sure that you, for example, the regulator knows and have the visibility of the incidents. The private sector are not feared to actually report or delay the reporting just because of the consequences in terms of regulatory. So this goes to the elements of capacity building, the strategic understanding of how the complexity of one cybersecurity incident can actually escalate it. And I truly believe that in order to do that, clarity, shift of mindset needs to happen both at the regulatory side as well as the private sector to encourage in terms of reporting, but also leverage on what we have pointed out clearly earlier regarding the informal relationship. If you already know, you will just say, do I need to report? Is this something that is... So this is, I think, in a way, a relationship that really will come very handful and practical during a major cybersecurity incidences.
Thank you so much for highlighting the element of the joint cyber exercises and overall this joint sessions between the regulators, but also between the sectors as the way to turn policy into effective operational enforcement strategy. And turning to XZ, maybe I could a little bit provoke the question further because what we discuss as well, what we hear from the partners within Geneva Dialogue, the current global outlook puts additional challenge on that, undermining trust between the partners, different partners. And even those partners are not in sort of any conflict situation or anything like that, still, different actors may feel less hesitant to share even the basic incident information. For different reasons. I guess people get more mature and more advanced in this field and may understand that any basic information may turn into the both offense and defense. And ASEAN region, unfortunately, we also see the conflict intensifies between the two members. And I wonder if that also creates additional environment where people may be more hesitant and more cautious to share the information. And Exi, if you have any sort of also reflections on that.
I think first and foremost, trust is personal. It's trivializing to say that trust is established just at two macro perspectives, like, oh, country A and country B trust each other. But the trust is always going to be born from, I've shaken your hands, we've sat down and had a meal together, our families play with one another, and so on. Right? That shared experience bolsters trust. And that neither party has actually infringed on the goodwill that has been established through those experiences. I think that's the prima facie for what trust really represents. And if the trust is at that level, then the informal communications is more powerful than the formal communications. The question that you asked earlier essentially is about, there are regulations and then there's enforcement, and how do you actually see it play out in ASEAN? Broadly, my appreciation is that there are, of course, written regulatory expectations and objectives. You cannot not write that. But where the color is unique in ASEAN, compared to, let's say, Western jurisdictions, is that there is the understanding of hard regulations versus soft enforcement. And that takes in, as Rashida highlighted, the deep appreciation that the regulators have about, if you are a small player in the scheme of things and you have your unique constraints, if I lay on the full effect of the law on you to set you as an example, what is the consequence? And I emphasize that word again. What is the consequence to my larger ecosystem? So generally, ASEAN regulators have a broad appreciation of the consequence and are managing it in concert to all the other aspects of risk that the nation or the region actually faces. And so there's a bit more level-headedness to then consider, in all balance, what is the effect that we want to cause. And even if I want to make an example of somebody, do I have to bring out my biggest stick, or can I create the same effect of improvement, because the improvement is the most important outcome, towards that. And where some of that plays out in the region is the rich public-private collaboration that actually happens. Um, there is no shortage of government agencies consulting with private stakeholders to then say, I'm thinking about this problem. What are your thoughts about it? Or we've all just come out from this kind of nature of impact or incident. What are the meaningful lessons learned? So the reflections coming from an incident or an event is not done in silo within closed doors, small pockets of people, but rather it's a whole of ecosystem reflection, which really derives a lot of meaningful lessons learned. And then different stakeholders will, of course, take away different lessons and different actions. But as long as everyone is progressing in the similar direction, which is in a positive direction, it is only for a net benefit to the whole region and to the country or the sector at large. So that is, I think, one lens that I would like to offer, which is there are laws, and then there is how you actually enact and enforce the law. There is a bit more humanness when it comes towards the application of the law that I've observed in ASEAN. Now, the other aspect why we evolved this way is essentially because at the first instinct, ASEAN countries and organizations that operate here already believe in that group appreciation and system of systems thinking. So the exercises that we do, not only just at the national scale, but also across borders, between friendly neighbors, as well as across the region, only help us to build more opportunities to bolster trust. I have a team member that recently supported an ASEAN capacity building program. And this is exactly at the wake of the conflict of two ASEAN countries. We know that the ASEAN Games, some of that exclusion actually played out by them by their own choice. But during this effect, because everyone knew each other, these two countries' representative did not feel under that kind of cloud to say that, oh, I cannot talk to you, I should not be sharing information with you. Rather, they were like, okay, that's the background context. It's like climate change is happening.
Mm-hmm.
I have my set of weather, you have your set of weather. I learned this, you learned that. It's just what it is because we're after the consequence management. And it's not for show and tell. It's really about if I fall, the other party might also be implicated. So that community defense, that neighborhood watch scheme, becomes a broader signature that I observe in the ASEAN region, as compared to, oh, because you're the naughty boy and therefore I need to make you an example and I put you up on the flagpole to make sure that everyone can see that these are your sins. Not so much.
Yeah, thank you also highlighting this aspect. And I really like the word humanist in putting the laws into practice. But back to your point about the reflections across the whole ecosystem. And I will ask you first now. In those reflections, for the past, I guess, 2, 3 years, which have brought to us so many new things for different actors. I wonder, do you see how the roles are shifting? I mean, the roles and responsibilities of governments, regulators, private sectors. Are there any additional elements that you already see or anticipate in the way what actually those actors are expecting from each other in ensuring the resilience and the protection at the national level?
It's interesting. I guess from the private sector, you can say that there's a maturing process that they have all gone through to
Mm-hmm.
understand how much they can actually help versus how much they actually depend on other players. So there's a maturity curve that happened in the private sector that I observe in the region. The second thing is, I think, as Rashida highlighted, the regulators and the government agencies are also becoming clearer in what their expectations are of different roles of different stakeholders. What is the expectation coming from the board? What is the expectation coming from the CEO of an organization? What is the expectation coming from a CISO? I'll give you a very quick analogy based on the work that I did recently. Um, in the West, there is a general notion that the CISO should be a very GRC focused, a governance, risk, and compliance focused role. But then when we take into reflection about some of the regulatory expectations coming from ASEAN and the larger Asia, you will see that there is a lot more priority towards operational effects. And why is because in Asia, we shifted the lens from should I find fault with somebody to how do we actually resume and recover from the impact as soon as we can. The consequence management lens is the top priority as compared to I need to throw somebody in jail, I need to find somebody some X dollars. If you look at the history of incidents and what regulatory actions happen, you would also notice that the regulatory action, if a penalty were to be laid upon, comes very much later because they want to make sure that the organization or the victims are truly recovered from the outcome. So the lens of resilience is then factored upon. All of us have this sense of let's get out of the consequence. Let's manage the consequence. Let's get out of the impact, sorry. And to be able to come to a state where we are comfortable enough and then we reflect on. In those reflections process, of course, there are lessons learned. And then if there is due need for punishment and penalty, then it should be laid out. But don't penalize somebody that is truly ignorant and not having faulted after doing all the due diligence. I think that's a broad frame of what I've observed in terms of that. But what is the challenge that ASEAN uniquely face? ASEAN generally, other than all the cultural elements, the language elements that are at hand, we are at a melting pot of using many different classes and types of technologies. We have, for a good part of history, depended on the Western technology stack. But increasingly, because we happen to also interface with many different stakeholders, we also have what is the emergence of the Eastern technology stack. But even complicating that, we also have open source or open source derived solutions in this mix, right? So when you have a non-dominant space of play in the technology fabric, then you have layer upon layer of vulnerabilities that you're managing. But if you were to try and deal with all these technology problems in and of themselves, it is a never-ending task. So when we prioritize towards the consequence management, what is the business process? So we use and apply the systems of systems thinking that it is not only that we have to solve the technology layer, but we also have to solve some process layer and then also the people layer. And then the people layer, it is where we think, and especially in ASEAN that I observe, we see a lot more fruits. Because in the end, you want something to be done. Today, we are not at the state where you ask a robot and the robot will carry out the activities. It's still somebody have to give an action, sponsor, an executive sponsor behind it, and then say, please carry out those things, and then let's track it and make sure that we make meaningful progress. And that everyone respects that, okay, this is the mission that we have to go to, this is the outcome that we desire, and so we will do it. So the resilience, if there was a sequence towards it, is first people, then process, then technology, right? Of which the technology layer, especially in where we see ASEAN accommodates technology, there's too much variety. And so we take on many different facets of vulnerability in that mix. And why we prioritize on people is also one more element, right? It is trivializing to think that, oh, I have my IT team or I have my technology team, and therefore they can solve all technology problems. The truth is further from that because I trained out of a certain set of certifications coming from one vendor. Now, you bring a different vendor's technology, I have to go and learn, spend that time to go and learn and familiarize with that. Now, going back to my earlier point where we have so many different mixes of technology, some of which are fairly well established and mature, some are emerging maturity, some are non-existent maturity because it's, let's say, open source or open source derived. It is community efforts, right? In that mix, to expect a technology team to embody all capabilities, it's a very tall order and it's very tough, right? So that's also another aspect of vulnerability. And then the further vulnerability I will call out is that when it comes towards the people lens, is that all of us might be technologically equipped, but to be able to apply that capability for the right outcome requires a long period of, I'm using the word very loosely, but indoctrination or familiarization of what is ethical use of technology. And that is often undervalued because it only takes one wrong move, one wrong path for a very competent technology person to then apply his skills for the malicious outcome. So that is something that we constantly struggle because in our region, there is also no shortage of temptations that may lead people astray. And so that struggle exists. There is already the technology problems. There's some of these people elements that we are also dealing with. And then process, we are constantly trying to update and upgrade them along the way. So resilience is not one-dimensional. My last point is actually this, that the resilience of the past, the conventional thinking was, I want resilience in my technology-themed perspectives. That means my technology folks, my technology layer, and the technology processors. Increasingly, borrowing the incident category of ransomware, it implicates a whole of organization, a whole of ecosystem, right? So then multidisciplinaries all have to come into play to establish a point of resilience. Whether the technology aspects are fully settled, more often than not, we see victims because they did not align or coordinate into business continuity management. They did not align or coordinate into public communications or stakeholder engagement and management. They did not arrange themselves to be engaged with regulators and larger resources of communities that can actually lend support to them. So thinking in silo causes a lot of weaknesses because and I alluded to that in your first question, which is that there are mastermind groups that are coalescing so much resources together to be a small entity trying to fight a large group is clearly a loser's outcome. So then that lens of resilience must come from a community and systems thinking.
Yeah, indeed. While listening to you, I'm also thinking that probably the strength and advantage of the ASEAN nations and countries as the communities of both the actors, various actors, is that at the very early stage on the cybersecurity path, you were either forced or you build this habit of working together. So it's not something that you are gradually understanding. Yes, we need to work together and build those coordination channels, the platforms. That was at the very beginning inbuilt feature
Yep.
and culturally inbuilt feature. And I think that's really a strength. And you have a market, which indeed, as you said, with a high variety of actors, market actors, players, tech companies, and solutions. But you already have this cultural foundation dealing with the threats through the coordination between the different nations, agencies. I think that's a really, really strength, especially these days as we see across different parts of the world. But turning back to Rashida, you also had different roles and portfolios with the different focuses. So I wonder if you also feel that your responsibilities are really shifting and evolving to something new, that you have a new element in your responsibilities.
Anastasia, can I throw in a fun fact? So
Sure.
it is represented by the ASEAN logo.
Uh-huh.
So if it's not well known, it's a bundle of rice
Yeah.
stalks
Yeah.
together, right? Because in ASEAN we eat a lot of rice. It's our staple food.
Yes.
And that context comes across where in the Asian storytelling, we have a very good story that says, if it is one stock, you can break it very easily.
Yep.
But when you bundle them together, it's very hard to break that bundle. So the strength in numbers is a core foundational cultural element, and that's already exemplified by the ASEAN logo.
Yeah.
Sorry,
Yeah.
Rashida, please.
Thank you very much, Exi, for a very comprehensive, I think I would say, operational and implementation element that you actually unpack on the questions that was asked by Anastasia. One thing that I would want to continue from what you mentioned is about the resilient, and hearing what you say is it goes back to the importance of the people element, because truth is, while we mention about cybersecurity today has becoming a board issue, is no more an IT issue, it is an investment no more than a cost. But reality is we do not have enough resources in terms of budgetary reality as well as people to be supplied and to carry out the tasks, which I think you already mentioned the complexity that we inherit while we are discussing about managing the vulnerabilities when we actually embrace the technology to ensure our digitalization and how we can maximize that. But we will keep on continuing inheriting the vulnerabilities, and we need to manage that within the budget or the resources that we have. So this goes to the importance of having the right leader for decision making. This is where the element where we talk about a proper and effective governance and how you actually position the accountability between the regulators, the stakeholder, the private sector, the technology developer, in terms of making sure that to the best that we can, we actually embed the element of security by design. It is easily said than done. How do you define security by design? So the thinking process, which I really love what you mentioned about the thinking, the system thinking, system of system thinking, where you actually need to leverage that while you are at national level. If we talk about national, you want to invest cybersecurity and look at the lens of national security, the international peace and security issue, geopolitical issue. But at the same time, you need to ensure the investments that you make is something that also can cover the economic element, the social element, where it cannot be separate anymore, like what the traditional security thinking is. If you look into probably the traditional thinking of how you actually have a plane or a ship, you can actually have a commercial and military ship to govern and to make sure that you can protect at national level. But for the development in terms of technology, because in order for you to maximize and also practice security by design, privacy by design, you actually need to invest at the earliest state. The right thinking, the right mind will actually look at the element where you can leverage in terms of cybersecurity as a national security issue, as a social issue, as a business, as economic issue. This is where actually the element of privacy and security by design can be derived. The right leaders, the right governance can actually materialize this element of importance. Another part that I think where I would like to extend a little bit based on what XZ mentioned is what would be the the important shift that will happen with regards to the environment that we are facing today. While, of course, I think you mentioned here and there regarding the clearer expectation on duty of care. When you have the right legislations, the right governance, you put the right accountability. So there are clearer expectations at national level. When we introduce the right legislation, you practice it. This is also will reflect a clearer expectation to the executive accountability, not just an IT team at the private sector level, at the organization level. So it will also materialize the element of how shared responsibility looks like, where it needs to be done. Because as an organization, you can only protect within your upper stream and lower stream. Outside that, there should be roles and responsibility of the regulator, of the government as a whole, of government approach at national level, maybe state level, to do that, which is complex. So another part is, of course, while we are talking about regional, I believe that cross-border coordination on incident handling, regardless, different ASEAN member states still have a different maturity of the legislation with regards to cybersecurity and business continuity and whatnot. We will still continue to work together in terms of making sure we can contain the incidences. And I feel that, and I have a strong belief that more and more pressure, a good pressure for everyone to be more open and transparent, even when the facts are incomplete. Because in my experience, I have worked with the technical people where their thinking is, I need to be 100% sure, then only I can present that. At the same time, I need to talk with the legal people and the diplomat where they really want to know where is it. So I think managing the expectation and giving the community that have different expectation to have a similar understanding. Okay, at this moment, this is what I see, and this is the only information that we have. Because that one particular incident, sometimes you need to do forensic until 3 to 6 months to get even longer than that, to get a confirmation of what and clear visibility of what actually happened during that time. So these are part and parcel of the things that I believe the shift will happen the moment we have the right people to make decision with regards to in terms of making sure the right governance and accountability at national level and at regional level.
I'll just add 2 points, and I think the need for translators is very necessary to be surfaced. The translators is not just from English to Japanese. It's not so trivial. Of course, there's that problem.
Of course.
But there's also, as Rashida highlighted most poignantly, is how can a technologist speak to a legally trained person? How can a technologist speak to my business leaders to help them understand and appreciate what is really happening right now? That context is understated because today, as I mentioned using the ransomware analogy, the impact is multidisciplinary. Right? It's cross-cutting across an organization, across multiple functions, and also when you look at the level of interdependencies in the supply chain, that may also go beyond the organization. So when all those multifaceted aspects come into play, and then putting the technologies as the only interfacing part will be defeatist in outcome, meaning it will be lacking in the effect that you desire to come out of the situation rather than to continuously get stuck in the situation. And that's also the reason why, one of the contributing reasons why incidents today are often said to have be finished in the scale of months, not so much in the scale of days or weeks, because of that multifacetedness of those impacts that we see. Now, the second one is really kind of a saying that is very Asian. We say our neighbors are more helpful than our faraway relatives. Because it's the person standing next to you that can help you the most effective, rather than a neighbor that stays, 3 days away, 5 days away. The help cannot come in time, right? So ASEAN embeds a lot of this thinking to then say we really need to lean upon our immediate neighbors to be able to help us most meaningfully. Of course, we will welcome all kinds of efforts coming from far away lands. But the person that can really bring the water to fight the fire in your house probably will be your immediate neighbor, rather than wait for the fire engine that might take another 15, 20 minutes before it arrives.
Yeah, that's sounds really, really real. Indeed, it's a good saying. Um, Looking at this neighbors analogy and applying this to the international level, let's say, and also we have the upcoming the UN process, the global mechanism, which starts next year. Still a lot of open questions how this will unfold, but basically we may already see that the challenges that the previous negotiation processes had in terms of different perspectives and strategies and a lack of trust between different states and the delegations, frustration of the non-state stakeholders about the modalities of participation. Probably the new process will inherit this, unfortunately. But let's see how a slightly new structure will provide probably for new dynamic. My question is to you, looking at this relationship between different neighbors, I mean, states and the actors in this big space, which is cyberspace, um, which trajectory now looks most plausible for the next decade to you? Deeper regional cohesion, gradual fragmentation, or close alignment with different cyber blocks? This greater polarization of different camps of like-minded actors, both private and public actors, and the closer communities and the groups within between them? Or you probably more optimistic about the way how this ideas about the governance at the regional or even international level will even have a probably more chances for success next year to address not only cyber in a general sense, but also probably the emergent technologies within cyber aspect, such as artificial intelligence, etc. So I wonder what are your personal probably feelings about the trajectory for the next year and beyond. So let's start with Rashida probably first, as also highly experienced diplomat in this field.
Um, uh, I believe that the one of the things that I learned at the UN, the discussion will continue, and whether we like it or not, while we try to focus in terms of the subject matter, there will always be a different kind of geopolitical element that will be raised during the discussion throughout my experience in the UN negotiation of the OEWG. But one thing that I've learned, and I feel that this needs to be continued, and I believe that my other ASEAN colleague also feels the same, that while we cannot solve all the problem at the UN, we can take and uphold the element of framework and responsible states behavior and continue to demonstrate that and operationalize it to the extent where we can go back to the table at the UN and show how actually ASEAN region, together with other regions that are willing to do so, operationalize these particular things. And the more people exercise and explain that and work together, we can actually show what actually happening. Because we know that as a national cybersecurity agency in each and every nation, we are not only looking into the discussions at the UN. Yes, definitely that would be part and parcel of the things that we do, but we can also take and embed that into our legislation. For example, this is the experience that I have in Malaysia. In our Malaysia cybersecurity strategy, though we do not really expressed in terms of each and every confidence building measure, each and every 11 norms, what we actually uphold. If you look into the strategy, it's actually aligned with what the 11 norms checklist that ASEAN has adopted and operationalized. This is also something that is not far away than what is envisioned at the UN. While when we conclude the final report, we do not reach the consensus in terms of the checklist itself, but at the ASEAN, we can continue the works, and we hope that coming the new global mechanism, we are not going to start from zero, from scratch. We can continue to demonstrate and emphasize in terms of what best we can actually works within the agreement that we already had earlier. Because, and I believe that the demand and the participations, not only during the UN negotiations, throughout the 5 years that I've seen that there are so many side events during the session, outside the session, even in the ASEAN, to discuss specific matters that actually comes from the UN, which I have never experienced before the OEWG happens. Now, if every single year we have an ASEAN ministerial meeting, AMCC, during the Singapore International Cyber Week, where one of the I would say the permanent agenda, because I have seen that, is about the discussions at the UN. Even the recently AMCC, there are also elements that reports the outcome of the OEWG and how actually ASEAN can work together in terms of emphasizing the operational element that we can do. So, of course, the UN will have a lot of things that they need to tackle with, but I believe that coming as a region, coming as a bloc, we can actually amplify one another and demand the right way of doing things. And at national level, for example, it will also reflects the approach that ASEAN has taken in terms of norms, CBMs, and practical cooperation. But the responsibility of the agency that look into cybersecurity is to translate to the private sector how does norms and CBMs can associate with the works that you do in terms of your business continuity, and how it actually can assist you in terms of incident response, and how it can link together with the elements on the cross-border part to leverage on the norms that we have agreed upon and confidence building measures. And also, this is the element that will be a continuous trust exercise building within the nation itself, internally, domestically, and also cross between one country to another within the region itself.
Yeah, indeed, for the external observers, which I am, listening to the inputs from the ASEAN countries within the UN or WG was indeed as an example of a really stronger voice, where each delegation actually amplifies each other, highlighting again the work that is done at the regional level and how the countries coordinate their efforts. So it's really, really fascinating and inspiring to hear that, just and to have that example, especially again these days. Ixi, I wonder what your also feelings coming from the private sector. In Geneva Dialogue, we try also to open the discussion and how Rashida highlighted how all of these norms and CBMs apply to the operational logics of the critical infrastructure, facilities, operators, and other actors. So I wonder, what do you think about the next trajectory for the next year?
I think the bottom line up front is I'm very optimistic. And that's the reason why I continue to support as a core member at the Geneva Dialogue. But maybe taking a bit more reference towards ASEAN, and Malaysia is this year the chair for ASEAN. The Malaysian PM said it best. ASEAN is a non-alignment at the core, And when it comes towards cybersecurity, I think Rashida had summarized it with a very strong focus towards the consequence and what is in the region's interest. And that's why your Anastasia, your observation that the ASEAN members seem to kind of resonate with one another is because where it is the most meaningful for the region, everyone already has aligned. The second aspect is really about, um, the region works in favor of what means the best for themselves and for our for the ASEAN region. And in that context, even if as a larger global nexus that there are certain obstacles at hand, where ASEAN thinks that it can be adopted, it will be adopted. And that's also highlighted in my personal observation. I think ASEAN members have been quite aligned and quite adaptive towards what has been highlighted in the CBMs. Uh, for those ASEAN nations that have established regulations and created guidelines, they are broadly in alignment. And I haven't seen any dissenters towards that. So that's why I'm fairly optimistic about it. I think essentially, as Rashida highlighted, working with like-minded stakeholders and the strong belief in building friendships and not stopping to learn and improve has helped ASEAN to become that position that we are in vis-a-vis the larger global stakeholders that are at play. But that's not to say that we are at the top, but rather we are definitely taking in the lessons and implementing where we can to the benefit of the region. So I think that's where the lens comes in. If I read your question deeper, is then clearly there are larger powers at play that are flexing and they want to create more influence and all that. Uh, Regardless of how those dynamics play out, the principle remains, which is non-alignment at core, focus on consequence management, and then building up the capabilities with like-minded partners. I think those three will shape how ASEAN will navigate this situation.
Yeah, indeed. Having been clear about this, the principles and the foundation really helps to sort of as the guide to navigate through the turbulent times. To close the conversation, I'd like to zoom out again and probably ask you also a personal question. If we look at it 2025 and if it's remembered as a turning point, what do you think it will be remembered for? And what must ASEAN countries or actors do next year in 2026 to strengthen the cybersecurity efforts or to avoid repeating the same mistakes and vulnerabilities? So let's start probably with XZ and then conclude with Rashida.
I would say that 2025 has demonstrated that the threat actors are not shy to carry out their effects. And their effects are increasing in sophistication and depth of impact, and even scale and reach. So the takeaways that not unique to ASEAN, but everyone should be bearing is that don't fight this fight alone. Need to start building out your context of friends, your context of an understanding of where you can lean on resources that are beyond yourselves. And then you are stronger together than alone.
Rashida?
I want to continue from what XZ mentioned. I think XZ emphasized in terms of collective and togetherness. And I would think in terms of collective and togetherness, the importance of what actually we really need to look into is mainstreaming the element of secure and trust, and making it as a differentiator of digital transformation. So we can really implement collectively in terms of security by design. So positioning any element need to be secured, need to be trusted. And this, when you mainstream that and making it as a differentiator for you to move forward in terms of digital transformation, it will actually solve in a way a lot of the elements that is truly important in cybersecurity, which is the cyber hygiene itself. So yeah.
Thank you so
I'll just add up one more point,
Yeah.
and that is, I think we are in the state where there's rising fragmentation, of which trust is lacking.
Yep.
So going forward, for any organization of any scale and scope, whether within a particular border, cross-border, national, regional, international in nature, I think every stakeholder should be invested in trust building. And going back to my earlier point, trust is not built because I'm brand A and you are brand B, and so
Yeah.
I trust you and that's it. But it's really about I know you, I've dined with you, I've had shared experiences with you, and we've gone through difficulties together, and we've come out stronger. I think trust building must be at the core, as borrowing Rashida's points, at the core of everything that everyone needs to do, because fragmentation is just happening, and I call it like climate change, right? It will happen. But if you submit to it, that's defeatist, and I'm an optimist, so I rather take the action that I hope and move towards progress.
Thank you so much. Listening from the European perspective, the trust is really at the low, I think, level, and it's felt, it's seen. Reading the different articles, the expert commentaries, and overall reading the news these days. But listening to your perspective, and again, turning my attention to what's happening in the Asia Pacific in terms of the different coordination. I think the brightest was also for our work within Geneva Dialogue, the publication of the ASEAN implementation checklist. It really, I sort of inherited your perspective, which is truly more optimistic, and it gives much more focus on the practical side. And what I really find fascinating about your region is how many actors actually try to find the points where practical cooperation can be built and must be built, aside of the more, let's say, emotional loaded different aspects of the current situation of the politics. So thank you so much, and I hope our listeners also made a lot of really interesting takeaways, because I did. I wrote a lot of notes. One of the important takeaway was for me again to highlight that protecting critical infrastructure, dealing with cybersecurity, is indeed no longer a purely technical issue, though it might be so 10 years ago. It really requires trust, coordination, realistic partnerships across different sectors, jurisdictions, people. And while the challenges are real that we discussed, that you have highlighted, the discussion, I hope, showed that there's also space for constructive cooperation. So thank you so much for your time, for your contribution, for your insights, and to our listeners for joining us. We hope this episode adds more help to ongoing efforts of different actors to strengthen cyber stability and responsible behavior in cyberspace. Thank you, and hopefully also a good ending of this year, a peaceful ending of this year, and hopefully for more really great opportunities next year.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.